Good afternoon. I'm Petrina Jackson, the Leah Jellen Portview Executive Director of the Schlesinger Library and librarian of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. When I was planning the exhibition, In Their Own Voices, Black Women's Lives from the Archives, I wanted to show a cross-section of women, famous and lesser known, to highlight their public and personal challenges, triumphs, and everyday lives in the area of identity, education, work, and much more. I also wanted to give an opportunity for students to respond to these archival foremothers, which 4 students did by making creative works based on 2 of the exhibition items and becoming part of Black women's archival lineage. The exhibition, In Their Own Voices, is dedicated to the memories of Ruth Hill, the first professional Black librarian at the Schlesinger Library and coordinator of the Black Women Oral History Project, and Emmeline Brown, archivist at the Schlesinger Library. Joining us today are panelists Taryn D. Jordan, Assistant Professor of Women's Studies at Colgate University, soul food genealogist, and Black feminist philosopher with expertise in aesthetics of Black domesticity. Kalimah Redd Knight is president of the League of Women for Community Service. The League was established by African-American women in 1919 in Boston and was and is dedicated to fighting for racial betterment. She is also Senior Deputy Director of Media Relations at Tufts University. And last but never least, Holly Smith, Spelman College archivist. Spelman is a private, historically Black women's liberal arts college in Atlanta, Georgia. The exhibition webpage provides links to the full bios of the speakers, and we'll post that link in the chat during the program. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and our annual donors who are watching this afternoon. Your generosity keeps the Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank you. We also want to gratefully acknowledge the Helen Blumen and Jan Acton Fund for Schlesinger Library Exhibitions for their support on this exhibition. We encourage you to use the Q&A feature to submit your questions at any time during the program, and we will address as many as we can. Since we anticipate a lot of questions, we ask that you keep them short. This will enable us to address as many as possible in the time that we have. Please keep an eye on the chat feature of the webinar, where we will post the link to register to view the exhibition or to schedule a group class or tour. Now we'll start with our first question. Taryn, as a professor and historian of Black feminism, you study how Black people use the concept of soul to survive and thrive. Can you give us an example of finding an item or a collection in an archives created by a Black woman and how it exemplifies soul?
Sure, thank you. That's an excellent question, one I'm really excited to answer. So as a philosopher and historian, I'm interested in how soul traced through Black women's domestic work for their own kin is a space of collective memory and knowledge that conveys how to live within anti-Black violence. So my early research question is, how do Black folks live in an anti-Black world? Was confirmed at my time at the Schlesinger. So after presenting my doctoral research in graduate school, a friend of a friend shared that Ella Fitzgerald wrote a cookbook and that the Schlesinger Library had it in its residence. I applied for a grant and arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the summer of 2017 and began to review Miss Fitzgerald's papers. So her collection consisted of 3 large manila folders and a variety of cookbooks. I was most interested in Miss Fitzgerald's papers since I wanted to find a link between soul food and soul music. Mostly a lot of scholarship about soul is about music, and much less is written about soul food, at least in the scholarship. And among Miss Fitzgerald's many papers, many papers that I found, there are promotional photos included within the collection. And I found an image of a dark-skinned Black woman with pearls and short dark hair among the photos. The figure was nameless. Mistakenly, I thought it was photos of Miss Fitzgerald, but perhaps taken years earlier, and included another woman, but it was another woman entirely. Still kind of confused, I opened the second folder of the collection, and the contents of the folder was a 200+ type pages of yellowed paper titled Soul, Food, and Thought, written by a Miss Aldine Louise Davis of Iowa. After flipping through the lovingly annotated pages, bits of masking tape and flurries of aged graph paper fell away from the yellow pages of the document. And I realized it was a cookbook like none I'd ever seen before. Miss Aldine's cookbook contained recipes, poetry, keys to the meanings of flowers, and philosophical narrative about soul. These collected fragments theorized a notion of soul that aligned with my own experience of soul through my family. My parents migrated from Pensacola, Florida, to Denver, all the way to Las Vegas, Nevada. And soul was always this really vitally important space for us to understand what life was like during Jim Crow, and how things still repeated with a difference in my childhood growing up in Las Vegas. So significantly, Miss Aldine's book confirmed my scholarly hunch that soul is an archive of Black knowledge that cannot be stolen, taken, or burned down or destroyed. And that sort of knowledge is produced through Black women's domestic labor that really drove me to understand, drove my study in my present, book, as thinking about soul as the condition of possibility for Black endurance of an anti-Black world in the first place. So you could say that finding Miss Aldine's cookbook at the Schlesinger and the funding I received radically altered my research trajectory.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So our next question is for Kalimah. So the Schlesinger Library acquired a small group of records from the League of Women for Community Service in 1955, but the organization has kept the bulk of its own records. Can you describe the collection and also why the organization feels it's important that they remain with the League, that the records remain with the League?
Thank you so much for that question, Petrina. So, the collection from a physical standpoint is about 60 boxes worth of items, all of which were taken from the League's headquarters at 558 Mass Avenue, which is a brownstone essentially in the South End neighborhood of Boston. The items were removed about 2 years ago as we were preparing for a renovation to the space. And if you can imagine, these were taken in boxes that were all stored in closets and drawers, just sort of scattered throughout the building. So the items include anywhere from letters, ledgers, minutes from a meeting, photographs, ephemera, anything and everything. If you can imagine your grandmother's closet, that was essentially in the collection. But really, to understand the collection, you sort of need to understand the League. And as Petrina mentioned, the League was formed in 1919. It was formally incorporated in 1920, but the women were really most prominent in the late 19th century. So they were truly sort of suffragists and women who were involved in post-Civil War, so very post-abolition. And if you think of Boston, Boston was a hotbed for abolition. And at the center of that abolition community were elite Black families. And the Black community in Boston was very small, but very influential in the dismantling of slavery. And at the heart of this community was George and Josephine Ruffin. George Ruffin, very famously, was the first Black person to graduate from Harvard Law School. He was the first Black man to earn a judgeship in the United States. And so his wife essentially was among the people that founded the League. But prior to founding of the League, she was very active. She was involved in a Black women's club called the Women's Era, which essentially had their own newspaper that was by and for Black women. They had a Black Women's National Conference in Boston in 1895. So the women were very, very steadfast, because the work of liberation is a very long process. And so through the turn of the century, they were helping Black soldiers who were stationed in the Boston area around World War I. And they continued to become organized and became incorporated in 1920. And so they were very much carrying through that early activist mindset. And what they did was they collected items that were very prominent and very much, in sort of the community news of that time. And so one of the items that the League has, which is probably our marquee piece, is a book called The Personal War Sketches, and it contains personal accounts of soldiers from the 54th, the 55th, and the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. And these are essentially their own narratives about where they're from, what battles they fought in, who they were under command of. And they're all collected in one book. And the book was commissioned by Mary Stearns. Her husband was George Stearns, who was sort of considered one of the architects of the 54th. And it contains her own personal explanation of how the 54th came about. But interestingly, the book is compiled by Pauline Hopkins, who was the first Black woman to write and direct her own play. And so she interviewed all these soldiers, including her stepfather, who fought in the Civil War, and recorded everything. And it's in one book. So it's a book written by a Black woman about Black men, commissioned by a white woman, who it's all basically contained in one document, and the League owned this document for years. So that's one of the items that we have. We also have a Ida B. Wells Southern Lynching Horrors pamphlet, which is on the internet, but we have a print copy. And as far as we know, we've had it appraised. There are 4 of these that exist in America. So we also have a number of other items of value. We have a collection of papers from Lewis Hayden, who was essentially the linchpin to the Underground Railroad in Boston. And Lewis and his wife famously gave their entire estate to Harvard Medical School to benefit students who were going to study at Harvard Medical School. And the endowment still exists to the day. When Harriet died, they gave their entire estate to Harvard Medical School, and it still exists to this day. We also have images from William and Helen Craft, who were famous fugitive slaves in that era. We have a whole collection of those papers that the women started, the Women's Era's papers. But we also have a number of post-progressive era items. We have a Du Bois letter. We have a Booker T. Washington letter. We have items from Mary McLeod Bethune. We have advertisements for socials. We have plays. We have Coretta and Martin's wedding invitation. The League served a number of purposes after its initial founding, including housing Black women who were coming to college, and Coretta Scott King was one of the women that stayed in the house. So we have documentation of her being at the house, and also her wedding invitation. We also have about 500 books. We have sculptures, we have art. We have a piece of work that was done by one of the only women graphic artists from the Black Panther Party. So the collection really sort of covers a tapestry of the Black experience in the United States pre-Civil War to the 1970s, to the Black Power movement. Just an amazing collection of different items. In terms of ownership, it's actually a pretty interesting and simple question and simple answer. For us, ownership has meant everything. It means the ability to tell our own story. There's something about a complete story from the beginning to the end that you can tell. However, owning a collection is a very complicated endeavor, and it costs money. It cost in space, and it also cost financially. And so we were very fortunate to be able to have a charitable support to appraise our collection and to house our collection. So preservation is one of our key tenets, as well as access, in addition to ownership. And preservation is huge because, I mean, I don't think it's any secret that our community is facing erasure in a lot of senses. So preserving that history is vital. And so I think we endeavor that all organizations who are able to support and preserve our history are important goals to achieve. So ownership is wonderful if you can achieve it, but preservation and access are very important. And so we're very lucky to be in a position to have ownership, to be able to preserve it, and to be able to make it accessible.
Thank you so much, Kalimah. Thank you so much. So Holly, how do we ethically collaborate to document Black women's lives?
Thank you so much for that question, Petrina. Just to share a small personal anecdote to show the connectivity. When I was in Boston in library school at Spelman College, I stayed in the house on Holyoke Street that was owned by the League of Women. So it's just really a delight and honor to be on the panel with Kalimah, Taryn, you, Petrina, and then just to kind of show, again, that connection and connectivity. So I think that's a wonderful question that you ask about the idea of, ethical collaboration. And I often think, as we all find ourselves, each of us in academia, you're working in a number of constraints, particularly regardless of the institution, honestly, but having worked at a predominantly white institution now, HBCU, one of the constraints I think is time. And one of the challenges I found in the previous position that I was in at UNC Chapel Hill was just the space, the time, the capacity, but also being one of the few, if any, Black women working across Black communities. So the first thing I think that we have to do, particularly if we're attached to any institution, I don't want to say I want to move and operate differently, even being at an HBCU where thankfully the archives, which we are connected to the Women's Center, we don't have to justify why Black women and Black people are important. That's the first step. But I think the most important thing when you're establishing relationships is just to do that, establish a relationship and not come from, particularly again with the academic institution, with your idea for a grant, with your idea for a project, with this mindset, this frankly patriarchal and patronizing mindset of how we want to help you. And it's, again, not lost on me as a Black woman at the HBCU that I can revisit those harms of oppression and ideology of privilege when coming into working with a community-based archive or institutions outside of the traditional academic archival structure. So I think the first thing is to really care about building a relationship, which can take months or even years to build and establish trust, but also transparency when you are working across community, across, difference, gender, age, identity, sexual identity, race, class, all these things they exist, and we can pretend not to see they exist, but it makes me think, paraphrasing the great Audre Lorde, it's not our differences that divide us, but it's our inability to recognize, celebrate, and accept. And just the idea of approaching communal collaborations with a sense of transparency, but again, a true sense of collaboration and not co-optation, I think is the important. So as you describe, Petrina, the relationship working with Kalimah and the League, it's a true collaborative, and just knowing you the way I do, Petrina, as an exemplary archivist, sister archivist and mentor, you're not coming with that spirit and energy anyway, but also for Kalimah and the League to be receptive and to establish a real relationship of trust, not co-optation, not extraction, like, well, only Harvard with its resources and money can be able to preserve this. Rather, how do we collectively do this type of memory work together? And what are the best ways that we can show up in, as individuals that care, but also with our institutions and best leverage our resources and relationships. So I think those are some of the ways with a true collaborative spirit, but definitely transparency and a desire to really build collaborative relationships are the great first step.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I want to bring it back to all three of you. And if each of you can give your own personal reflection on your archival work and how it has impacted you personally.
This is Taryn. I can't say enough how finding this Miss Aldine's cookbook has affected my life. It's one of those things where when you do archive research, one of my mentors, James Ford, told me right before I took this trip, because the Schlesinger was the first archive trip I ever took. He was like, look, something weird might happen. And I don't mean to sound all woo, but weird things happen in archives. And, you know, I think I've written about this in other places. When I opened this cookbook, I felt like I found an ancestor that was not my own, right? So me and Miss Aldine are not related. Her family is very much still in Iowa and working on her documents and papers. And in fact, through a strange twist of affairs, I ended up being in contact with them. But I do feel like I found a kindred thought leader, someone who in a different historical period was writing about something similar, but didn't quite have the sort of social structures that, and, you know, possibility for her to be able to study and write about these things. So I found her cookbook, and in there she has what I call these philosophical narratives, where she talks about Mama's soul and Papa's soul. And Mama's soul is about taking these bits and bobs and making it into something. And here she's talking specifically about food and being able to hold soul and body together. Whereas Papa's soul was protest soul, and a kind of soul that you go down to the bar or into a public space, and it has this lament into it, right? This sense of like loss, and wanting to sort of organize and do something about this loss. And I think in other works, because I'm a gender studies scholar, I read that loss as a loss of masculinity, a loss of manhood. And so to be able to have this woman who was sort of, you know, loved living in Iowa, loved her family history of how they migrated there. And she collected all these bits of information in Black history about Muscatine, Iowa, and had the audacity to put her papers at the Iowa Women's Archives, where they so lovingly received me, was phenomenal. And in fact, I was able to her family had no idea this cookbook existed at the Schlesinger. And so I was able to sort of connect her family to this item that she had sort of given away. Now, how Ella Fitzgerald got her paper, I do not know. And there's a lot of things I could say in my, you know, moments while traveling and thinking about it as sort of fan fiction. But yeah, it was incredible. And it feels so much like an honor to be able to sort of follow in her legacy.
I can take that next. So I think I'm just so moved by just the way you're framing the scholarship about the ability to connect to the soulfulness of a person outside of, especially from a historic lens. We don't often get to do that because it so humanizes us. And I think that's a very big challenge for our history, in terms of just understanding that these were people, they had challenges, they had joys, they had sorrows, but they somehow persevered in the most challenging of circumstances. And I think, for us, all of us who are on the board of the League, that's been such a theme, and in this stage of our organization. The League was very prominent, has a very, unique early history. It's gone through a lot of transition, and we're sort of in a vested stage of sort of bringing it back. We're sort of going through a renaissance and sort of retooling and repotting the organization. And then, the ability to kind of dip into the archive has been such an incredible joy, and blessing, because we kind of get to go back and see what was going on with these women. How did they do this? And, the theme of ownership is really key for us, because had they not owned the building, I don't know if we would have access to the archive, because the building protected the archive. And so because they somehow were able to independently buy this building in 1920 and retain this archive. And I should say that many of the items that were brought to the League were given to the League specifically because it's a Black organization, because I think there was an awareness that there was an ownership and there would be protection. And so in some ways the League was bound to keep those promises. But the soulfulness and the way they kept those items is such a treat, because you see sort of the newspaper, but you also see what went behind that. And so we have an item that is actually from Florida Ruffin, who was Josephine's daughter. And she wrote a senator to basically praise him for voting for what they call a Negro comptroller in New Orleans. So if you were in politics, if you did something to advance the race, you would get a letter from someone in the League telling you did a good job. But what the women did, and what blows my mind, is that they kept everything. So they wrote out. So for that particular letter, the Florida wrote out what she sent him, and she's essentially telling him that he did not bow to cowardice, that he went above and showed courage to make a vote that he did, and he was a man of the people. So you can see everything she wrote, and then she had his letter and she attached it with a little nail. So you just see that they were documenting how they operated and how they advanced the race. And not only they advanced the race, but she talked about women and men need to basically make these type of decisions in order for the United States to move forward. I mean, this is incredible. And they were saving it so that we could know what to do. It's almost like they left a blueprint for us about how they survived and how they pushed the country forward. And it's just so moving, I think, for us being in the stage where we are now, just to see how they just persevered through, again, the most challenging of circumstances. And as we're going through a rebirth as an organization, it's been such a source of inspiration just to see what they did, and to be, in a lot of ways, get a charge out of that. I think representation is not just unique to the Black community; it's unique to everyone. I went to see Wakanda Forever in Cambridge, and they had a scene that took place at MIT. And when they showed the campus, the whole theater lit up. It was like everybody was so excited just to see themselves on the screen, and that matters for everyone. And so to be able to fill that knowledge void, I think, is such a personal, incredible opportunity for not only, Black women, but all people to see the contributions of this one particular group through the archive. So it has such a powerful impact, I think, on our organization, and of course, onto me personally.
And
And
how?
Petrina, I apologize. Could you repeat the question?
Absolutely. So can each of you give your personal reflection on your archival work and how it's impacted you?
Thank you. I was so wrapped up in Taryn and Kalimah's amazing answers. I was like, oh yes, what's the question? Well, I mentioned before, and even when I was at Chapel Hill, but especially Spelman, one of the, and not to idealize or essentialize, but one of the greatest parts about not only being connected to the Women's Center, but at an HBCU founded for Black women, is that we don't have to justify why we are important. And I include myself in that, because I think one of the strengths is the connection and connectivity, as myself, as a Black woman, being a steward, the main steward, but a steward, is I think we're all committed, as Taryn and Kalimah mentioned, to the support and preservation of our histories, her stories, our stories. Is I think there's that strength in being able to make connections and connectivity where I see similarities with my own family, my own communities, as well as, like Kalimah mentioned, even if there's not the direct correlation, there's a kinship and community that can come from this memory work and this sharing across our experiences. And I think one of the, just when I think of just how special a place the archives at Spelman are. Just a little bit of background. I keep mentioning we're connected with the Women's Center because we know a lot of archives are in academic institutions are embedded within libraries, which have its own advantages. But we are actually a component of the Women's Resource and Research Center, founded by Dr. Beverly Guy Sheftall, which is the radical progressive space for activism and the incubator for student awareness and community engagement on campus. So to be connected to, just a very active center and connected in a way where we are an integral part of the Women's Center, we are the repository for Spelman, and we document the history from the founding in 1881 to the present, but we're also a special collections. We have the papers of Audre Lorde, great lesbian mother warrior poet, of the incredible cultural worker, filmmaker Toni Cade Bambara, but a number of other women and individuals whose lives are just as rich and important. And I think the fact that we get to activate them through not only course instruction, film, and some of the typical ways, but we get a lot of people, because we're open to the public, who just want to encounter material. They just want to touch Audre Lorde's journal, and because they have their own connection and connectivity to her work, or they want to become acquainted with Toni Cade Bambara. But also, more importantly, they had a relative who went to Spelman. I'm chuckling and thinking a student said, Miss Holly, I want to see something really old, like, from the 70s. And I was like, oh, I got my toe on the, but in also just an interest and a desire to be connected to something from the present, to stay connected with who they are. And the most important thing is the students at Spelman see themselves in the archives. And the space, we are just very intentional about crafting a Black feminist archival practice of equity, inclusivity, and openness. And just to be able to show up every day, and again, I'm not idealizing, but I would be lying and saying if it wasn't just a treat to be able to show up in a space that was specifically crafted around communities that I know and familiar with, but I've been in so many other spaces where that was absolutely not the case. And I think that can make me more self-aware and transparent, like we talked about earlier, how I show up in my connections and collaborations with just other people in general, but especially other people who, have a caring connection to the history of Black women and Black people. And I really like using the term memory work, which I first heard from a sister colleague, Skylar Hearn, because I think it connects us. You don't have to necessarily be a trained archivist or librarian or historian to care and be invested and involved. Again, thinking about the women in the league and thinking about, I am dying to see this fantastic cookbook, because, just even with the intentionality, or even if it's, I just think of people who just happen to collect things because they like them. These are just the things. This is the fabric of humanity in this work that we do. And so when I remember that for myself, and not including just egos and feathering my cap, like this is community, this is humanity based, because we can see what happens when there's, erasure of history, erasure of communities. So yeah, I think just that is the empowerment, and but also the purpose that I like to show up in every single day that knits us all together.
Thank you so much. So we have lots of questions from the audience, and so I think I'm going to move on to that. And here's one question that is takes a very quick answer, and it is for Taryn. And it said, can you share the name of your book on soul, please?
Mm-hmm. So that book is under, I'm currently writing it right now. So the book won't be out for another few years. I just, I'm in my third year of my TT job. So it's coming. I saw that in the question and answer. I will surely share it when it comes, but it's not quite out yet.
Great. We look forward to it when it does come out. Yeah. So another question. I'm moved by much of this conversation, especially how each of you are speaking of particular individuals' relationships, joy, reaching across generations through archives. I'd like to hear more about how institutions/archives can hold space for relationships. What kind of innovations or practices, if cost was no hurdle, would you like to see that supports this aspect of archives? Holly, did you wanna, or I don't know who, anybody.
Go ahead, Kalimah. I'll go after you.
I'll just speak briefly, because really I'm sort of feel like I'm the kind of the lay person in here. I don't have a degree in archive management. I've just come to, be a little bit, of an expert in our own archive at the League, just because I've spent so much time with it. So I really do come as a person from the community who, was aware of the League growing up, but never really participated. And so I am sort of a kind of a fresh, perspective, I like to think about just this body of work. But I think what's been most helpful for us is to really, use that word partner with us about the collection. And one thing I didn't mention is that in addition to having an archive is very expensive and challenging because of space and finances, but you pay for it in some capacity. You either pay for it in ownership or copyright of it, or you have to actually pay for it. And we are very fortunate to be able to have access to, a charitable, support through Simmons University, where the archive is being held. But being able to work with people who have a vested interest in talking to us about the parts of our collection that we think are strong, and to take parts of it, because we desperately need resources as a community organization. And it makes such a tremendous difference to be able to work with academics, because they're able to document and verify the work that we have, and to do papers and to study and to learn more and to interpret and to compare it to other works. And so I think connecting with organizations like mine or others to figure out what is this that you have, how can we help you, and learning what parts are important for us. And finding a piece that might connect to your own scholarly work, and to study it and to write papers and to talk to your colleagues about it, to find opportunities. We've had several student groups come in to take pieces of our work and to study them. We had a student group do a museum management guide. We had someone who sort of rebuilt parts of our website. But these are all things that students can learn, and gives them an opportunity to learn about these items and to get them out in the community. So I think that partnership piece is really key to it, and it's been instrumental for our organization.
And Petrina, forgive me again. Yes, could you repeat that again?
Yes, let's see.
Thank you.
Oh, I think I lost that question.
I'm sorry. And I think I remember just how institutions can really foster more.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Again, I'm getting so caught up, like, yes. I mean, and really, I think, again, what you, Petrina, and what Taryn and Kalimah have said about the importance of partnership, but also having worked in academia and having worked at Spelman now, I'm grateful to have such a supportive situation. And I know we don't all find ourselves. Dr. Guy Sheftall she's incredible and really understands archives in a way, and understands the importance to give the autonomy, but the support. So I think it also, just saying this publicly, would behoove people in higher positions of power to also make room for relationship building and have the space and support, and not necessarily just focus on the bottom line for the institution, but again, what is just beyond what will be good for any institution, but what it will be the good of these collections, of these community interactions. So, and I know often people find it hard to be in positions to make space for the time to, build relationships when there's this crunch, whether it's a grant or an initiative or project. But that's where I really feel like it needs to come from someone like a Petrina, who's already doing this work and who's amazing and who gets it. So the short stories be more like Petrina, but to really be an exemplar of setting the tone for leadership about what's important, and rather than just some, static deliverables, like, okay, we want to process this many, we want to do this. It's just like, how can we enrich our collaborative relationships? And again, I think of a term another sister colleague, Shatra Powell, used called slow archives. And again, the idea of being deliberate and intentional. And I think we just kind of can equate the idea of being fast and quick, process these collections, get them out. But again, it to me, it is about building trust across institution and across community. Again, just because I'm a Black woman doesn't mean I'm going to stroll up into the Black communities, whether it's in Detroit or Las Vegas or Boston, and just have the hubris and arrogance to think that I could just stroll in just because we have an essential quality. It's just about relationship building, understand the nuances and differences of individuals, institutions. And that could, again, take months, years, but it's also just showing up. It's showing up to programs. It's getting going beyond Spelman's campus or Harvard's campus or Tufts campus or Colgate, any campus, and also calling people in. But I just think, again, I think the model of the connection with the Women's Center has been a great model, because there's an intentionality about the collaborative work and supporting the work of activist organizers as well as students, and the calling in. So I just think that really can be more of a top-down priority as well, but also kind of, again, thinking of the slow, intentional pace that it takes to really build relationships. And also, I think having the pleasure to work with, we have some amazing students at Spelman, y'all. When I tell y'all the just the courage, the bravery in terms of their activism, they're speaking out, they're galvanizing, and so I also think making sure to have student voices included in these conversations. So I guess really just even intergenerational conversations around community building as well. We've definitely seen it in the Women's Center with the Tony K. Benbar Scholar Activist Collective, which to my knowledge is one of the longest running celebrations of a Black woman feminist, which has been, I think we're on our 21st year. And it culminates in a conference now every 2 years with research found about Black women, but it's student-led. So I just think, again, having these intergenerational connections and connectivity across this memory work has been invaluable to again, enrich relationships, and also think beyond, just to get some fresh new ideas.
So that brings me to another question, Holly, that came up about engaging students. So the person wanted to know, what's the suggestions for engaging students to use archives and primary sources when they automatically use AI or Google for research?
This is a very real concern. I've been in a lot of meetings since the emergence of ChatGPT and its various other iterations about what it means to evaluate students. And I didn't teach it last year, but I do teach a class on feminist research methods, where one of the assignments is that we go to Colgate University's archives. And Colgate University actually has an excellent collection of student-created archives based on student activism on campus. And Colgate's a very small liberal arts school in central New York. And so, you wouldn't think that Colgate would have sort of Black Lives Matter based collections, but because this was an important moment on Colgate's campus throughout the 2010s, there's a decent amount of items and objects that students have created alongside the help of archivists there. And so there's no way that an online, artificial intelligence that's, probably could scan some sort of finding key item or finding, what is it called, a finding tool for your university archives materials, but the likelihood of the specificity of the objects that are inside the archive are likely not going to emerge, right? Because some of those items don't exist online in the same way. And so that is one thing I've done, is really having the students look for feminist histories on the very university campus that they're in. And then second, because, you know, the pandemic, et cetera, in my a senior capstone course, one of the assignments that my students do is to spend some time with the Angela Davis digitized archives, the Schlesinger. And so, you know, I use some of the letters between her and George Jackson, and my students have used the some of her speeches and things for projects that, once again, ChatGPT can't get to the specificity of this one particular moment. So certainly it's hard, you know, students are going to use whatever they can to get through, to sort of get over and get an assignment done. But I think part of what I've done is sort of welcome it and not make it the boogeyman. And generally, you know, try my best to weave between the lines. Students, you can't take a student who's not capable of writing a sentence and then turn in a whole essay that's written in this very beautiful prose. Generally, you know, there's something has happened there. So the best I can do is have students really sit with the objects and encourage them to kind of write about their own emotional attachments and the things that come up for them. So, yeah.
And I think to add onto, oh, I'm sorry, Petrina.
No,
excuse
I
me.
said very good. That's all.
Well, really to add on to Taryn's excellent point, you know, I'm paraphrasing Tony K. Benbar, the idea of making revolution irresistible. I see one of my roles is to make this work irresistible. And so thankfully, through our connections, not only with our colleagues in comparative women's studies, but the relationships I've had being at Spelman almost 10 years, colleagues will have their students come and integrate a visit to the archives as parameter for, you know, an assignment. And we will do course instruction with our colleagues at Spelman, but across the Atlanta University Center, but virtually and digital across. But it's just something I think about the way that we're able to get them hooked. And this is, you know, again, thinking about not only students, but at the AUC, but when they see the interest and passion, like I've had the pleasure of looking at the comments, and people have been so wonderfully commenting about our excitement, our joy, and their passion. I think they see that, and it hopefully it can cause, you know, stimulate the intellectual curiosity that's already there, excitement. But I think exactly like Taryn is saying, when just to make sure I can emphasize whether I'm going to a course instruction session, whether I'm going to a student-led event, you know, just to show support, but to show up. I also really like to preach the gospel, but really in the wonderful students we connect with, like, hey, we really would like to collaborate with you to document your student organization. And again, collaborate. And I say the students are incredible about, I don't even often have to bring something. Miss Holly, we're dropping this off to the archives. We're doing this. Do you want? And I think, again, just being able to build the relationship, show the passion, but already show, you know, kind of talk to them how they're already doing it and how can, you know, through Snapchat, through Instagram, through, oh, I already like to take pictures. And I unfortunately think sometimes there is the idea of like, oh, you wouldn't want student stuff in the archive because it's not important, it's not famous. Where to me, that is the heartbeat of the activity on campus. So I think demystifying, like you said, the archives, like you don't have to be doing serious research, whatever that means. If you're just curious, you want to come in, which we'll have, like we're kind of in a prominent location on campus where we get traffic of people asking for directions. So sometimes we'll just talk about them. And I want to give a huge shout out to my wonderful colleague, Nicole Carr, who just started with me in January, but she might be more excited than I am to get, since she's just done a wonderful job, you know, just to, I think once they see the excitement, they can see themselves in, and when they don't see themselves, particularly thinking about just the work that has been done by Afro-Kedian or LGBTQI Student Association, to be like, well, we're not seeing the history of queer students or the experiences of LGBTQI students at HBCUs we want to add more. How can we excavate that history again? So they're leading the charge a lot of ways in these archival silences, and helping to correct that, and just getting excited. So I just think that making archives irresistible, like the revolution, is just one way to really get students engaged and excited. But that also makes me engaged and excited too. So again, thinking about the collaborative relationships, then it allows me to think about what we can do to, again, continue to do this work together.
Excellent. We have a question about kind of like the ordinary things in collections. So people don't necessarily think of things like personal cookbook or even a wedding invitation as having cultural significance. Can you talk about the contribution of these items that may be viewed as mundane to collective culture, memory making, and soul?
I love this question. I think part of what I'm up to in my research is I'm after these mundane things, which I love, Kalimah, that the League of Women's Voters have the invitation there. Because so much of what structures university archives and what has value are things that fall under, what is it, like documents of state, bills of sale, like things that are very kind of, what's the word for it? Like traditional documents that should be kept to maintain an official line of history. And things like cookbooks and wedding invitations are not considered important often. And what's really funny is, in talking with a colleague of mine who worked at Emory's Rose Library as like a graduate student archive processor, she often talked about like when they were processing archives, they would often set aside things that were to be thrown away or given back to the person's papers that weren't considered important. So things like children's, drawings, doodles on a Post-it note, etc. And my research is all the refuse, right? Like I need all the weird bits. I want the cookbook that has this sort of inscription in it that we don't exactly understand how Ella Fitzgerald got. I'm always looking for history in the places that are considered inessential, because that is the space of the work of the feminine, oftentimes. And so I'm curious about these sorts of objects because they do still tell a story, and give us, and sometimes that story is not always clear, but sometimes it has a sort of aesthetic reference. So I would love to see this invitation because I want to think about the sort of handiwork that went into making it. And if I could figure out who made the invitation and trace that sort of history. So it becomes less about what's the words on the page, but more so about the sort of effort, or what I call the aesthetic judgment, or the series of decisions that was made to keep this item. Because while it may be tangential to larger archives, this item is obviously important to other forms of history, which I think is the kind of breadth of what may constitutes Black history in general, but Black women's history or the Black feminine history in particular.
Yeah, I think that's so great what you just said, because I think those items are what make you a whole person. At the League, we have teacups. We have all these because they were into entertaining. So we have all these teacups. We have they had a lot of whist parties and like ice cream socials. So we have all these little those little wooden spoons. We have so many of those. We have Black funeral programs. We have a bunch of those. And it's amazing just to look at them. We have so many sort of mundane, but I think the League is unique because we have some really big, interesting items, but we also have like the very sort of the napkin settings. We have the sashes that they wore in parades. They did a lot of printing. So we have like the printing, original templates. So it's just a beautiful quilt of a life. And I think a lot of that, especially for women's history, a lot of it gets ignored because it is not of that traditional setting, as Taryn mentioned. But so much work was happening on the part of women to make it so. And so being able to display that for just the realness, the sort of the realness based of what it was is such a gift, because we are all whole people, and to be able to provide that picture is such a gift. And I think it also just demystifies history. just to see, that this wedding took place and it was sent out by Coretta's parents, is just, and to see their names and to see where it was, it really just brings it back to anyone, who's had a partnership or a wedding in another place. You get a wedding invitation from, someone's parents. And so I think as much as we can bring that history down to earth, make it real for people, I think really goes a long way in making it personal and really inspiring people to see themselves, because you feel so much better knowing that people just like you came before you and were somehow able to survive. And I think especially in this era where there's so much going on about race and how do we unify as a country and how do we manage this very tough history that we have as a nation, being able to see and touch and see ourselves, and especially for students, I will say, who go to these predominantly white institutions, they are often isolated. They are often trying to figure out and navigate these spaces. And it's challenging. So to see someone else who did that makes a big difference. I was very fortunate to go to an HBCU. So I feel like I have an experience of being at the center of an institution, and also what it's like to not be considered at the center and how you manage that. And it's not easy, but to be able to go into an archive, I mean, I'm like nuts about archives these days. I'm become such a big fan of it because it's so rich and so fruitful, I think, for people who have the ability to kind of drink in that space and that experience and be able to take it on as their own.
So we're going to wrap up with the last question, and that question is, what has been the role of recent technology in finding, collecting, and preserving these important historical items? So I would like to just tackle this a little bit, because it's a very broad question, and most people, I'll use Schlesinger for an example. We want a large audience of folks to come and see our collections, and most folks will only see them via technology on the web. So this exhibition has a web exhibition too. It's not totally in full, but it is there. And also when you look at our collections, when you're trying to find our collections online, we often have actual images of them. Is everything digitized? No. Because that's always the answer. Is everything digitized? No, it isn't, but a good amount of things are. And so you get to travel to the archives remotely or, virtually, so to speak, and to get to have a view or a snapshot into someone's life remotely. So technology has really kind of democratized access to information. So it's not just, we're being very climate aware here and environmentally aware. So lost my power, it's back. So we're very aware of that. And we're also prioritizing marginalized communities as far as the things that we digitize as well. So people will have more access in a way that perhaps they didn't before.
I know we're running out of time, but I want to note one thing. My first book project's about the analog, but the second one's about the digital. And one of the things I want to encourage everyone in the crowd, everyone listening, is to look at the stuff in your family's homes. I know that I had a project 2 summers ago where I hired a photographer who took photos of my mama's house, my auntie's house, my sister's house, because I was really interested in how the stories attached to these things told something about my family's migration from Pensacola, Florida to Las Vegas. And what was really cool about that project was that digital photography made it possible, but also, old-fashioned staring at stuff and asking questions also works too. And I think that there's something really useful about talking with elders and other folks in our families about these stories and collecting your own archives, because your stories are important also.
That's a perfect way to end our discussion today. And I just want to thank you all for joining us in our discussion today. And we hope to see you at the Schlesinger Library and for you to take an opportunity to see in their own voices in person and on the web if you can't make it to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.